Imagine waking up one morning to find out that the most powerful empire on Earth didn't fall because of bombs, invasions, or rebellion, but because of a single financial threat made behind closed doors. No explosions, no dramatic last stand, just a quiet ultimatum that erased a century of dominance in a matter of days. Now here's the part nobody likes to talk about. That same invisible weapon still exists, and many economists believe it isn't sitting in history books anymore. It's aimed straight at the United States. There's growing buzz online that the year 2026 could be the moment when the illusion finally cracks, when America discovers that real power isn't measured in aircraft carriers or headlines, but in who controls the flow of money when confidence disappears. But that moment didn't come out of nowhere. In the 19th century, Britain wasn't just another powerful country. It was the system. Its ships controlled the seas, its factories supplied half the planet, and its flag flew over nearly a quarter of the world. If global trade was a game, Britain owned the board. And at the center of all that power sat one quiet symbol, the British pound. This wasn't just money, it was the language of global business. When countries traded, they used pounds. When banks stored their reserves, they held pounds. When contracts were signed across oceans, the numbers were written in pounds. The world didn't just accept British currency, it depended on it. That dependence gave Britain a superpower no army could match. They could spend more than they earned and no one panicked. They could borrow at tiny interest rates because everyone trusted the pound. They could run massive trade deficits and still live comfortably because the world needed their currency more than Britain needed discipline. From the inside, it felt like immortality. British leaders genuinely believed they had cracked the code to permanent dominance. Empires had risen and fallen before, but not this one. This one was built on finance, not just force. It wasn't supposed to break, except while the world still trusted the pound, something dangerous was happening behind the scenes. While Britain was busy enjoying its position at the top, a new power was quietly rising across the Atlantic. The United States wasn't making noise about it. It was just producing more steel, building more factories, and generating more real wealth year after year. By the early 1900s, America had already become the largest economy on Earth. But here's the strange part. Almost nobody acted like it. Britain was no longer the most productive nation. Its industries were aging, its competitors were faster, cheaper, and more innovative, yet the world kept treating London like the center of the financial universe. The pound stayed dominant, British banks stayed influential, and the empire kept behaving as if nothing had changed. This is what economists call inertia. Systems don't update the moment reality shifts. The world sticks with whatever worked yesterday because changing is inconvenient. Infrastructure is already built, habits are already formed, trust is already placed. So even as Britain's foundation weakened, the illusion of power stayed perfectly intact. From the outside, it still looked like the king. But under the crown, the bones were thinning. Britain wasn't running on strength anymore. It was running on reputation. And then the wars forced Britain to reveal what it had been hiding. World War I was the moment Britain's mask finally slipped. To survive the conflict, the empire borrowed staggering amounts of money. By the time the war ended, the country that once financed the world had become one of the world's biggest debtors, owing huge sums, especially to the United States. This was the crossroads. Britain could have accepted reality, tightened its belt, and rebuilt from a weaker position, but that would have meant admitting the empire was no longer what it used to be, and that was unacceptable. So in 1925, British leaders made a decision driven more by pride than by math. They forced the pound back onto the gold standard at the same value it had before the war, pretending the damage had never happened. On paper, it looked like strength. In reality, it was financial self-harm. To keep the pound artificially expensive, interest rates were pushed painfully high. Businesses couldn't grow. Exports became too costly for foreign buyers. Factories closed. Jobs vanished. Entire communities were trapped in long-term unemployment, all while the government insisted everything was under control. Britain wasn't just struggling. It was suffocating itself to protect an image. Still, the illusion survived, because Britain found a way to trap the world. By 1931, the pressure finally became too much. Speculators attacked the pound. Britain was forced off the gold standard, and its currency lost a huge chunk of its value almost overnight. For most nations, that would have been the end of the story. But Britain had one last lever to pull. Instead of letting the pound fade naturally, the empire quietly leaned on its colonies. India, Australia, Pakistan, and dozens of other territories were pushed to keep their reserves in British currency, whether it made sense for them or not. The message wasn't written down in headlines, but it was understood. If you were part of the empire, you played by London's financial rules. This didn't fix the underlying problem. It only delayed it. The pound stayed relevant not because Britain was strong, but because Britain still had enough control to force demand. The system was being held together by obligation, not confidence. Some analysts today point out patterns that feel eerily similar. Global systems don't always survive on merit alone. Sometimes they survive because the alternatives are inconvenient, expensive, or quietly discouraged. Whether those structures last is another question entirely. But then came the moment when pretending stopped working. In November 1956, Britain finally played the last card in its deck. When Egypt's president moved to take control of the Suez Canal, British leaders saw it as an insult they couldn't tolerate. The canal wasn't just water. It was oil, trade, prestige, and the last visible proof that the empire still mattered. So Britain joined forces with France and Israel and launched a military operation to seize it back. On the battlefield, everything was going their way. British troops were advancing. Egyptian defenses were crumbling. From the outside, it looked like a return to old glory, one last reminder that the empire could still throw its weight around. But behind the curtain, Britain was seconds from financial ruin. The United States was watching closely, and it wasn't impressed. Reports say President Eisenhower saw the invasion as reckless colonial behavior that threatened global stability. So instead of sending troops, America reached for something far more powerful. They threatened to dump every British pound they held onto the open market. At the same time, they moved to block Britain's emergency request for international financial support. If those actions went through, the pound would collapse. Britain would be unable to import food or fuel, and the economy would grind to a halt within days. That's all it took. Just 11 days after the invasion began, Britain ordered a ceasefire and pulled out completely. No dramatic surrender ceremony, no final battle. The greatest empire in human history didn't lose to another army. It folded under the weight of its own debt. And this is where the story stops being about Britain. Because when you strip away the accents, the uniforms, and the old black and white photos, the pattern Britain followed starts to feel uncomfortably familiar. The United States today still sits at the center of the global financial system, just like Britain once did. The dollar is the world's go-to currency. Governments hold it. Corporations trade in it. Entire economies are built around access to it. That privilege allows America to borrow massive sums, run endless deficits, and fund a military footprint that spans the planet. But reports claim the math underneath that system is starting to wobble. The national debt is climbing at a pace that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. Analysts warn that interest payments alone are on track to become one of the largest items in the federal budget, quietly crowding out everything else. At the same time, there's been a lot of buzz online about countries looking for workarounds. China and Russia settling more trade in their own currencies, BRICS nations discussing alternative payment systems, longtime U.S. partners quietly diversifying their reserves. None of this means the dollar is done, but it does suggest the world is hedging its bets. From the outside, America still looks unstoppable. Massive economy, dominant military, global influence everywhere you turn. But that's exactly how Britain looked right before the illusion shattered. Power on paper can survive long after power in reality has started to fade. But here's what should scare you the most. Empires don't usually fall in dramatic explosions. They fade, quietly. For years, sometimes decades, nothing seems wrong. The headlines stay confident, the currency stays strong, and life goes on like it always has. That's exactly how it felt in Britain. From the end of World War I to the 1950s, the decline was slow enough that most people barely noticed. Then, one crisis came along and compressed 30 years of weakness into 11 days. Many observers say America has been in its own slow burn phase since the 1970s. That was the decade when the dollar was cut loose from gold, trade deficits became permanent, and debt stopped being an emergency and started becoming normal. None of that caused an immediate collapse. It just planted seeds. What keeps economists awake at night isn't the steady drift. It's the idea of one unpredictable shock. A political standoff that rattles global markets. A financial scare that makes investors hesitate. A geopolitical humiliation that changes how the world views American power. No one can say which event it would be or when. But history suggests that when confidence breaks, it doesn't crack, it snaps. And the numbers for 2026 make this even harder to ignore. When people hear about reserve currencies and global finance, it all sounds abstract, like something that only affects bankers in glass towers. But when Britain lost control of the pound, it didn't hurt spreadsheets, it hurt families. Savings that took decades to build quietly lost value. Imported goods became luxuries almost overnight. The cost of food, fuel, and basic necessities climbed while wages stayed stuck. Industries that relied on cheap materials from abroad couldn't compete anymore, and jobs that once felt permanent simply vanished. Within a generation, the comfortable standard of living millions of British citizens had taken for granted was gone. If something similar ever happened to the dollar, the impact wouldn't stay on Wall Street. It would show up in grocery bills, rent payments, and loan statements. Everything America imports, which is most of what fills everyday homes, would become harder to afford. Interest on mortgages, cars, and credit cards would spike. The idea of a stable middle-class life could start to feel like a story from the past, rather than a promise for the future. This isn't about panic. It's about understanding what's really at stake when a nation's currency stops being trusted. But here's the part nobody likes to talk about. Britain didn't lose its empire because it ran out of ships or soldiers. It lost it because it ran out of honesty with itself. For years before Suez, economists and officials inside the system were warning that the numbers no longer worked, that the debts were too large, that the lifestyle was no longer sustainable, that the empire needed to change course. But those voices weren't celebrated. They were pushed aside. Some were branded pessimists. Others were treated like they didn't love their country enough. Many observers feel that the same emotional pattern exists today. Not the same facts, not the same circumstances, but the same reflex. When the math becomes uncomfortable, it's easier to attack the messenger than to face the message. It's easier to believe that history owes you a future than to accept that every empire is temporary. Britain had its moment of truth in November 1956, when decades of denial were compressed into 11 irreversible days. The only question left is this: when America's version of that moment arrives, will people recognize it for what it is, or will they only realize it after the illusion is already gone?